I've got a card scraper and a cabinet scraper here. Stick around and I'll show you how to sharpen both of these tools. I'm Greg Swenson and this is the Swenson Woodshop. Thanks for selecting my channel. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to click the subscribe button and the little bell for notifications when I upload new videos. You can also now follow me on Instagram and see what I'm working on between video updates. This is the fourth and final video in a four-part series on how to sharpen woodworking tools. If you haven't already watched parts 1 through 3, I recommend that you circle back and watch those videos as well. I've got two different types of scrapers here. This is the standard card scraper. It's simply a rectangular piece of high carbon steel that's used for smoothing a surface by scraping the edge at an angle across the surface. It's the most common type of scraper used by woodworkers, and it's also one that many woodworkers have difficulty learning how to sharpen correctly. This is a cabinet scraper. This tool is modeled after the Stanley number 80, only with a nicer bronze casting. Here's a less expensive version of it in cast iron. A lot of woodworkers refer to these two tools interchangeably as cabinet scrapers, but while both of these tools are scrapers, they're sharpened differently. The card scraper is filed, honed, and polished to have square edges, and then burnished to turn a hook along the edge that works like a micro hand plane to cut a shaving. You can also use it without turning a hook. Marquetarians, individuals who practice the art of marquetry, often use a card scraper without a hook to level the surface of marquetry work where you don't want an aggressive hook scraping thin veneers. The cabinet scraper, rather than having a square edge, has a 45-degree bevel ground along its edge and is honed and polished just like a hand plane, but with a hook turned along the sharpened edge. The first step in sharpening a card scraper is to file the edge square to the faces. I don't refile the edge every time I resharpen this scraper. Often I simply give it a few strokes on a medium grit and then a fine grit stone, which removes any trace of the previous hook and squares and polishes the edge enough to turn a new hook. But with continued use, the edge will need refiling occasionally, and for this demonstration, I'm going to start from the beginning and file the edge. I have this homemade jig for holding a single cut smooth file square to this inside surface. This jig is simply a piece of maple with a slot to hold the file, and I've added a couple of thread inserts for set screws to hold the file in place. Some black magic marker on the edge of the scraper will show me where I'm filing. Be careful not to file too much on the leading and trailing edges, or you'll create a slight camber across the scraper that can make it difficult to polish the edge on your bench stones. With that being said, if you do get a little camber on the ends, don't fret. The outer edges of the scraper are seldom used, and in normal use, they don't even touch the surface of the wood because of the way you hold and flex the scraper. Okay, that looks good. While I'm at it, I'll file the opposite edge as well. It doesn't take much to sharpen both edges while I'm doing it, and in use, it's nice to have that second sharp edge available so I can just flip the scraper over and continue on when the hook on the first edge gets dull. I'll actually turn a hook on both sides of each edge so I have a total of 4 cutting edges to work with. That looks good. I'm a big fan of ceramic whetstones, as you'd know if you watched my sharpening part 1, 2, or 3 videos. However, I use my diamond stones when I'm sharpening scrapers for 2 reasons. First, honing the edge of a scraper can easily wear a groove in the whetstone if you're not careful and moving the scraper around the stone frequently, like every other stroke. That's not such a concern with diamond stones, as they're a little more durable, although I still move the scraper around to even the wear. Second, this scraper blade is 2 3/4 inches wide, the exact width as my whetstones, so honing with a guide could be problematic. But these diamond stones are 3 inches wide, so no problem using a guide. If you can sharpen freehand, the width of the stone is not such an issue because you can orient the scraper to fit the stone. But if you suck at freehand sharpening like I do, well, you get the point. As I discussed in the part 1 video, a sharp edge is the intersection of 2 surfaces with 0 radius. That concept, as I applied it to chisels in the part 2 video and to hand planes in part 3, also applies to scrapers. I used to try and polish the entire face of a scraper, and I can tell you that was an exercise in frustration. When I eventually learned about the ruler trick and that it works on scrapers, I was, well, the ruler trick popularized by David Charlesworth is so named because it uses a thin stainless steel ruler laid on the edge of the sharpening stone to slightly elevate one side of the blade, or in this case, a scraper. Elevating one side promotes polishing a narrow margin adjacent to the edge that has no impact on turning the hook on a scraper. I prefer to polish the side faces using the ruler trick prior to polishing the edge. This is the reverse order from what I normally do as I demonstrated in the part 3 hand plane video, but I find I get a crisper, sharper edge if I polish the faces before the edge. I'll mark the face with a black marker so I can see where the scraper is making contact with the whetstone and work it back and forth to get a polished margin. Holding onto the scraper can be a little difficult. I have this piece of wood with some foam weather stripping on the bottom that helps grab the face of the scraper and also distributes pressure evenly across the surface. I'll polish all 4 faces. That looks good. There's a little corner here that didn't quite get as much polishing as the rest of the edge, but that's okay. That's out on the corner in use. That part of the scraper doesn't even touch the wood. That looks good. Again, same problem on the opposite corner. That one looks good. And that one does too. So we got all 4 faces adjacent to the edges polished. The next step is to polish the edge. I use a block of wood with a square edge as a guide to hone and polish the edge. Some black marker is again helpful to see where the edge is contacting the stone. I'll start with the fine grit and see how the edge cleans up. That's looking pretty good. I'll give it a little bit more. Again, I'm moving it around on the surface of the stone just to even out the wear. Actually, that looks really good. Flip over to the extra fine side of this diamond stone. Well, that looks really good. We got a nice polish on that. That should work just good. The next step is to turn the hook. This is a 2-step process. The first step is to burnish the face adjacent to the edge. The theory behind this is a bit obscure, but it's generally that it work hardens the steel and draws out a slight burr along the edge that is then easier to turn when burnishing the edge to form the hook. I have a Lee Valley burnisher. It has a nicely polished surface to resist galling and is significantly harder than the scraper. 4 or 5 strokes of moderate pressure should do the trick. I'll do it on each of the 4 edges. Now I'll roll the edge to form the hook. I've clamped the scraper in my bench vise to hold it securely, and I've added a few drops of oil on the edge to reduce friction. I start by burnishing the edge at 0 degrees and then at about 5 degrees. I'm actually targeting 5 degrees, but sometimes it might be closer to 10 degrees. I don't get too caught up in the exact angle because it really doesn't matter. In use, I'll adjust the angle and pressure I hold the scraper with to suit the hook angle and the materials I'm working with. I use a couple of moderate pressure strokes to turn the hook. Not a light stroke, but not a heavy stroke. And then I feel for a hook. The hook can be fairly small and difficult to see, but you will definitely feel it when you rub your finger across the edge of the face. I generally turn the hook on all four edges so I won't have to stop working when one edge gets dull. Couple strokes at 0 degrees. Now let's go at 5. I'll go ahead and flip that over, and we'll do the other side. First, a couple strokes at 0. And then at 5 degrees. And there's the burr. Those are the kind of shavings we want to see. Sometimes, despite following each of the steps I just demonstrated exactly, I don't get a good hook and all I get is sawdust instead of wispy curls. Don't despair. Before you go back through all the filing and polishing, try returning the hook. A couple quick strokes on each side will straighten the hook back onto the edge, and then you can return the hook. Sometimes you can repeat this process of returning the hook up to 3 times before you need to go back to the file or the stones. This is a cabinet scraper. It's basically a card scraper with a set of handles for ease of use. But sharpening it is a little different than a card scraper because the blade or scraper has a bevel surface ground at 45 degrees. It's more like a combination of a hand plane and a card scraper. To sharpen this scraper, I'm going to hone and polish the bevel surface and then use the ruler trick to polish a margin on the back side adjacent to the cutting edge, just like a hand plane. But then I'm going to turn a hook on the cutting edge just like a card scraper. I'll use my honing guide and set the protrusion or angle at 45 degrees. I like using a honing guide not only because I suck at freehand sharpening, but also because I know the sharpened edge will be straight and square to the sides of the blade. I'll start with my coarse diamond stone and work through to the extra fine stone. There's a burr. We'll move to the fine stone now. Okay, got a nice polish there. Give it a few more strokes. And flip over to the extra fine. That looks pretty good. Now I'll use the ruler trick to polish a margin on the backside adjacent to the cutting edge. Okay, that's a sharp edge, and if this blade was going in a hand plane, we'd be finished. But now we need to turn a hook on the cutting edge. Like the card scraper, this is a two-step process where I'll burnish the backside first and then roll the edge to form the hook. I'll start by laying the blade on the edge of the workbench, bevel side down, and with my burnishing tool, I'm going to burnish the backside using moderate pressure to draw out the steel along the edge. That should do it. Now I'll roll the edge to form a hook. I've clamped the blade in my vise and I've added a few drops of oil to the edge to reduce friction. I'll start by burnishing the 45-degree bevel surface and then add 5 degrees to each stroke till I get to about 15 degrees, or the burnisher is about 30 degrees from the horizontal. A couple strokes at moderate pressure should do it. And I feel a hook, so we'll stop right there. I'll load the blade into the scraper from the bottom side so I don't disrupt the hook. Tighten up the screws a little bit. And bring the thumb screw on the back side just snugly into contact with the blade. Let's see how that works. And need a little more. There we go. And that's what we want to see coming off our cabinet scraper. So that's my process for sharpening scrapers. The key point, just like chiseling planes, is to polish both sides or surfaces of the cutting edge and then turn the hook. This completes my 4-part video series on sharpening. There are a few other woodworking tools I could have included, like hand saws, but I think I covered the primary tools most woodworkers sharpen most frequently. I hope you found my videos useful and informative. But if I didn't answer one of your questions, drop me a question in the comments and I'll try and answer it. Otherwise, there's a wealth of information online nowadays, so just Google it, and I'm sure the answer is out there. Now I need to get back to actually building things and stop pontificating in front of the camera, although that's fun too. Till next time, I'm Greg Swenson, and this has been the Swenson Woodshop. Now get out in your workshop and build something.